Well, we're a couple minutes past, so I feel like we should get started pretty soon. I know people are still jumping on. I'm going to share in the chat here something that I shared in an email earlier, which is that Google document, which has messaging points and lots of the content that we're going to go over tonight. So that's just a good thing to have on reference. And then I have a few slides too with some of that material to share, so it's not so bulky. But I think we should start with just quick intros. There's not a lot of us on here, and a lot of you all have been working on these issues for a long time. And so what I'm really hoping is that this can be kind of a really informal sort of discussion. I'm happy to share the messaging guide pieces that we put together, but I would love to also hear a lot from all of you about the work that you've been doing, your experiences, giving comments, and any other additional wisdom that you can offer from those experiences. Yeah, so I guess to get us started, I can introduce myself. We can do a quick round of introductions, and then let's talk a little bit about why we're here and the context, and just dive right in from there. Does that sound good? Awesome. So I think I know most of you, but not all of you. My name's Sam Kropp. I am currently the Forest Waters Coalition Coordinator. So I've been working with that coalition, which is about 20 member organizations, mostly conservation groups and river keepers, and some grassroots organizations as well. And also we started this Forest Waters Watch program, which is mostly completely made up of grassroots folks who are basically doing monitoring in their own watersheds and engaging with DEQ and ODF on behalf of their own watersheds. And that's kind of what we're here to do today, is talk about how everyone can advocate for their watersheds at these upcoming meetings. So I'll pass, again, Sam Kropp, she, her pronouns. I'm hailing right now from so-called Portland on the traditional lands of the Clackamas. I'll pass to Cheryl.
Thanks, Sam. So I'm Cheryl Bruner, she, her, and I'm on the board of directors for the Williams Community Forest Project. And so we're an activist group monitoring the forest for primarily BLM activity. In our watershed, there's 55,000 acres of BLM. And then there's private. And within that, recently, BLM started 2 new projects. And so one we have a prescription for, the other, they haven't reached a decision and we don't have any information about that. So so our monitoring we're going to actually start that with Kiana. So I can't say that we've had a lot of, our monitoring has always just been knowing what's going on and being aware of ferns and having public comment for private forests. And that's been the extent of it.
Thank you, Cheryl. And hey, Catherine, thanks for jumping on. We're just doing a quick round of intros, just names, pronouns, and what organization you're working for, or what watershed you're with is great for now. Do you want to go ahead, Catherine, since you just jumped on?
Sure. I'm lucky to be in the Bull Run and have fought for it and sat on boards for it. Catherine Thompson, I'm with the Environmental Caucus of the Democratic Party.
Doing this pass to whoever. The only person who's gone so far is me and Cheryl. We can't hear you, but let's say Richard, because you're unmuted. And then go ahead and pass to the next.
Hi. My wife, Suzanne, and I live on Arcadia Beach. And I don't even know how I connected with Sam in the first place, but we are interested in water issues in this area. We're sort of orphans in Clatsop County, not really part of any municipality. So at today's meeting, I'm interested in what works and what doesn't, and how to get effective messages across, because my read is that the various organizations are often ignored, and I want to know how to get past that.
Let's go to Peter.
Yeah, hi, I'm Peter Carnig. I live in Oceanside. I'm currently the precinct committee person for the Democrats. And I work a lot with uh, watershed protectors, with North Coast Communities for Watershed Protection. And tonight, I'm just interested to see what kind of examples of messages that you guys are suggesting so that I can hand them off to a bunch of other people.
Awesome. How about Heather?
Hi, I'm Heather, she, her pronouns, and I'm with 350 PDX Forest Defense Team. And I am getting, often get requests for, make a comment and have no idea what I'm going to say or how to say it. And it's just so much work that I don't do it. So it would be nice to have just a nice basic framework to adapt and be able to be more responsive to those requests. So thanks very much for doing this.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks. I'll pass to Tiana.
Hi, I'm Tiana Smith. As Cheryl said earlier, I'm the new Forest Watch coordinator for the Williams Community Forest Project. And my position is fairly new, so I've just been kind of doing all these trainings on how to get our forest monitoring program implemented.
Let's go Nona, Betsy, and Grace. And that's it. And okay. Oh, it's hard to hear you. You might need to switch out your audio.
Oh, yes, I do. I will do something really quick.
Maybe while we wait for you, Nona, to switch it out, if it's going to take a minute, we could just go to Betsy and then come back to you. Does that sound okay? Oh, there you go. You sound great now. Go for it.
Now you guys are really hard to hear. I found you through, I think, SOCANs, the natural resources, and I'm keep struggling about really where to take off, because or what to start to work on, because I really feel our forests are incredibly carbon sequestering, and we are just devastating their ability, the private lands particularly, and then to hear all the other things that they're doing, like the drinking water. Because I had looked at the Department of Forestry, why it was formed, and the State Department of Forestry and why it was formed, and what were its precepts, and it doesn't seem to be following any of the reasons that it was formed, which was protect water. It was initially formed to protect watersheds. So anyway, that I would like to figure out how to get these messages out to more people.
Thank you for being here. All right, Betsy and Grace.
Hi, I'm Betsy Herbert. My video's turned off, but I hope you can still hear me. I'm a PhD scientist, watershed management, forest management. My research has been forest management for drinking water source protection. So it's kind of my little backyard here that I'm interested in. And I'm zeroing in on specific rules and regulations and some of the laws that are just completely terrible that need to be changed. And that's what I hope to address in some of my comments. I guess I could give an example of one of them. And that is that they need to be monitoring the turbidity of the water that comes into water treatment plants. They are monitoring it, but they're not saving the information so it doesn't become public. And that's the information that you need to prove that it's the logging that's causing the problems. So we need to get that, so they need to save that and make it public information. So that's one example of a comment I'll be making.
Thank you, Betsy. And we're definitely going to dig into some of the asks too. So let's circle back to that ask when we get there. All right, Grace, go for it.
Hey everyone, can you hear me? Okay, sorry, I'm having terrible internet connectivity today. I'm Grace Brailer. I use she, her pronouns, and I work for Beyond Toxics on traditional lands of the Winfeli Kalapuya. I am the Oregon Climate Action Plan and Policy Manager, and so I've been engaging mostly with the Board and Department of Forestry, both on climate planning and carbon sequestration, as well as water quality issues related to pesticide use, and all sorts of things. So wanted to just make sure I was in the loop with messaging to the EQC as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Grace. And Grace was a big help in putting together the messaging guide that we're going to be going through, as was Betsy, and many of you folks on here as well. So we should, collaborate in this process. I'm going to go ahead and jump in though with some of the context of kind of what we're doing here, and then we can talk about our key messages. But just
Sam, can I
Yes.
introduce myself?
Oh, Darlene, I'm so sorry. Did not mean to skip you. Please do.
Okay, so I'm Darlene Sherman, she, her. So I guess I'm in Bull Run watershed, which is protected, but I am just interested in this issue because I think it's a really common problem throughout many communities in Oregon that are dependent on watersheds coming through our forest. And I also think it's a common ground issue because everyone needs clean drinking water and sufficient quantity. And so especially for some of the rural, at least previously timber dependent communities, I think it's a common ground issue for many of us.
Thank you, Darlene, and so sorry to skip you. You are one of the folks who's been working on this for a really long time, so great to have you here. To offer a little bit of context of just the reason why the Forest Waters Coalition is working on this right now, I think many of you know and have been following the developments that have happened recently with the Private Forests Accord, which has been a pretty monumental step in terms of creating buffers for fish and steep slopes and other things like that. However, that agreement was focused specifically on aquatic species. And we're here today to talk about drinking water, which is something that the agreement does not explicitly address, and certainly could have implications for and will have implications for our drinking watersheds. However, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of securing protections for our surface drinking watersheds. And so that has really been the focus of our grassroots campaign in the Forest Waters Coalition for the past year or so while these negotiations have been going on, and will continue to be the focus of our campaign moving forward until we can actually see some movement happen in expanding protections for our human drinking watersheds and not just for aquatic species. And so just a little more context. I mean, obviously, as we know, this is a very well documented and historic problem. Basically, a lot of you folks here have been fighting for a long time. We know Oregonians as a whole have been fighting for many, many decades to try and get better protections for drinking water. Rockaway Beach folks have become kind of a lightning rod as a community that's gotten a lot of attention for their efforts to protect their drinking watershed. And I know some of you are hailing from there in that community right now. Hi, Peter. And what we want to cite, one piece of information that we often cite is that in the past 20 years, there have been more than 30 communities who've contacted the DEQ with concerns about logging. And so this is a well-documented problem. And during that same 20 years, at least 24 communities have had at least 40% of their drinking water, of their drinking watershed clear cut. And so that is, while all these concerns were being raised to the Department of Environmental Quality, the damage was continuing on a pretty incredible scale, on an expansive scale. Other important pieces that are part of the context are that the DEQ, as the agency responsible for ensuring clean water and the enforcement of the Federal Clean Water Act, the DEQ has actually begun historically to look into this issue. In 2017, the DEQ was going to release a study on the impacts of logging in drinking watersheds, and that study was shuttered. And the study was shuttered because of pushback from the timber industry. And so I'm telling all of you this context, and I think a lot of you know all of this, but this is just what we're operating in. This is the water that we're swimming in when we have these conversations with state agencies. There's a very well-documented history of a problem, a well-documented history of communities engaging with that problem, and a well-documented history of the agency being essentially too afraid to or unable to adequately address the problem. And so if you're interested in a little more about that specific study that they almost released and never did, here is an article that Catherine shared with me a long time ago on that subject. One more very important and relevant piece of information just in that context is that right now the federal government also does acknowledge that our state is not meeting federal clean water standards. And so the state of Oregon is not receiving $3 million a year that we would be receiving otherwise because of that failure to comply. And so there's clearly a problem. And I start with that because in so many of our interactions, we come across, a lot of agency or timber industry representatives, and Betsy and I have had this experience a lot lately, who say there's no problem. There's no problem with logging in Oregon's drinking water supplies. And so our number one effort right now in these public comments is to prove, to demonstrate that there is a problem, that it's well documented, and that it doesn't just exist. This is not a problem that is only for a couple watersheds like Rockaway. This is a widespread problem that's affecting many watersheds across the state. And so our goal with this comment writing push, not just for the November 17th EQC meeting, but for future meetings of the Oregon Department of Forestry and the EQC, is to turn out lots of people who are saying the same key messages, demanding more protections for drinking water, but bringing their own stories forward, bringing their own examples forward of why that's important. So that's kind of what our messaging points are going to get into. I'm going to share my screen with some of the key messages, but before I do that, just going to pause in case anyone wants to add anything to that context or clarify anything.
Yeah, could I say one thing? I think it would be very helpful to get maybe as many as 10 or 12, examples touching different aspects of this issue that could be sent to a whole bunch of different people, including all of us here today, so we can spread the word as well. So people can get kind of a primer on how to get going and how to come up with good testimony. That's it.
Other thoughts? That's a really good idea, Peter. And I want to talk about, before we get off this call, I'm hoping we can talk about strategy so we can walk away with how we're all going to come to this meeting. Does anyone else want to add anything in terms of content before I share my screen with our key messages or context? Okay, I'm going to go for it then. All right, so should be able to play here. Can you see my screen? I'm seeing vague notteries. Okay, great. So this is a really sad picture of a clear cut. I wanted to show this when I was talking about the context of the problem, but here it is, the context of the problem. Rampant clear cut logging across our watersheds, especially our Oregon coastal watersheds. So what are our key messages? These are what we are recommending people try to focus their comments on. This is not an exhaustive list, and it is iterative, meaning that we'd like to change it as we go, and your input would be really helpful. But number one, we actually need the DEQ to do their job. In the context that I just talked about, There is a documented history of Oregonians reaching out to DEQ with concerns. There's a documented history of clear-cut logging impacting our watersheds, a history of not receiving federal funding, and a history of the DEQ almost reporting on it and getting silenced. And so they kind of, they know what they have to do. They know this is their job, and we need them to do their job. And so that's pretty simple, but we're just basically asking them to step up and do what's necessary to protect drinking water, because so far they've failed. And we think the language too of doing your job is probably better than anything else, because it is their job and we want to remind them, this is not our job to do this, this is your job. Polluted water is costly for our communities. I think costly is the key word here, both economically and in a humanitarian impacts and a health impacts way. It's costly. This is really important, especially when we're speaking to water managers, when we're speaking to local city officials who have to bear the brunt of those costs. We actually have someone who is a member of our Forest Waters Watch community who is a volunteer water manager for the rhododendron watershed. And he firsthand experienced the costly nature of protecting his surface drinking watershed by being forced to pay a huge sum of money to just buy a larger buffer around the drinking watershed to protect it from clear cutting. And the costly nature of it is what got him involved in our coalition. So this piece is about how there are already communities who, we'll get into some examples later, who are being forced to pay the price of having to update their water filtration systems, of having to filter out the increased sediment delivery from landslides that are caused by clear cuts, and also who are being forced to just completely switch their water intake sources entirely from one to another, because there's just no way to treat that dirty water. So clear cuts and drinking watersheds today pass off the cost to our communities tomorrow. And I want to also say, just deviating from the script here, that this is also more important given a small piece of the private forest accord, which actually snuck in a requirement that if the DEQ or if anyone petitions the Oregon Department of Forestry to revisit their management practices, and that leads to them having to potentially change their management practices, they are required to engage in an economic analysis. Historically, that analysis only had to consider the impacts on their timber revenue. And so of course, their conclusion would be, we're not going to change practices in the benefit of environmental or drinking water. But now the accord has actually required them to consider drinking water and economic consequences to water treatment plants, among other things, including fisheries and recreation. And so the economic piece is actually not just huge in a rhetorical way, but it's very important because we now have a legal hook from that angle. The third point is that everyone deserves clean water. I too, I'm like Catherine, lucky enough to be calling in from the Bull Run watershed, where we're from a pretty wealthy, as a whole community, Portland here, and we have had a protected watershed for a long time now because people have successfully advocated to protect it. But that's not the case for everyone. And what we do know from studies that have been conducted on water scarcity and insecurity is that poor, low income, and communities of color suffer the most from drinking water inequities. And then in the context of climate change and lack of investment in these clean water treatment plants and clean water in general, it's going to be the communities of color and rural and low-income communities who suffer most. And so everyone deserves clean water, not just those who have the wealth and privilege to advocate for it. And the last one is drinking water can't wait. This is an urgent issue. It's not just important, but it's urgent. In the face of climate change and the ongoing industrial clear-cut logging practices, which are huge in scope and scale, these problems are only going to get worse without action now. So the time for change is now. The urgency is key. Those are our key messages right now. I want to pause for a minute and see if you all have additions, subtractions, things to comment on. What do you think? Peter, I see you.
Yeah, I think that global warming is heating up, no pun intended. More and more people are thinking about it, and it's the very same issue there. I mean, anything that we do protecting our water and the critters' water would also help us have a planet to live on in more than 50 years, to put it bluntly.
Thank you. The climate piece is huge. Darlene, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I have some questions. One of them, there's $3 million a year that the state's not getting from the feds because forest practices aren't meeting the standards. Where is that money go if it's restored because they improve the forest management practices?
That's a great question. I don't know exactly where the money would be going to fund. Maybe Betsy does, who has done a lot of digging into this. Betsy, are you there?
I'm here. Could you repeat the question, please?
Where would the money go if we get the $3 million a year back from the federal government? What would it support in our state?
Yeah, it goes to the agencies who are involved in protecting, I think it would go mostly to the DEQ. Maybe the Department of Water Resources, but it would go to the agencies. The agencies are the ones that are losing out right now from those monies.
So state agencies. Thank you, Betsy.
I have another couple questions if I could. In the packet that you put out, there was something that was talking about the SBBT rules. What is that?
The SSBT, and I took that out of the final messaging guide because it isn't directly relevant to drinking water. It's relating to salmon, steelhead, and bull trout.
Okay.
It was actually, so Oregon's water supplies have been out of compliance on a number of different things.
Mhm.
And, but this messaging guide was focused on drinking water. So I took that out because it has to do more with fish.
So what about the MOU between DEQ and the Department of Forestry that's just about to be finalized? Does that address this issue of best management practices within the Department of Forestry?
Thanks for asking that, Darlene. That's something that I didn't bring up in the context, and I should have, and that's important to bring up now. So not to be confused, there have been 2 MOUs recently that are pretty high profile. One I mentioned in the beginning, which is we're calling the Private Forest Accord, which focused on aquatic species. The one that Darlene is talking about is rather new, and it's an agreement between the 2 agencies that are essentially responsible for overseeing logging and drinking water, or logging and water in general in the state. And that's DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, and Oregon Department of Forestry. They entered into this agreement, and the agreement is focused on how they're going to work together to better the state's water quality. Now, we submitted coalition comments as a Forest Waters Coalition on that new agreement, basically stating that, sadly, the agreement doesn't go nearly far enough to do what's necessary to actually meet any of these key messages. The agreement has no concrete timelines or deadlines that would advance steps toward addressing or changing management practices in drinking watersheds, and it has no accountability or enforcement. And so really what we're saying is we need y'all to do way better than that. And these are our key messages in the context of that new agreement where they should be working together, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I see Catherine's hand too.
Well, if Darlene has more questions, keep going, Darlene. You're doing
No,
a
I'm
good
done.
job.
Thanks.
I just wanted to highlight in point number 4 that you can add quantity of water. So in the face of climate change, even without climate change, industrial clear-cut logging and primarily plantations decrease summer water quantity by 50%. And in the face of climate change, that's just unacceptable because people don't have enough water, even, you know, even if they have to filter it more, you know? So throwing in water quantity as well, I think is really important.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's kind of what we're getting at with drought and water insecurity. But I think it's worthwhile to say quality and quantity, because we also, and if y'all want to kind of check out that source that Catherine just cited, there's some info on that in the science portion of the messaging guide. But that 50% statistic is huge. And from a strategic standpoint, we really should be focusing on water quantity in a big way, because that, if we want to see a change to clear cut practices and not just bigger buffers, we're going to have to talk about clear cut plantations depleting water supply. It's not just bigger buffers won't help with the quantity issue. Ending clear cutting and moving towards selective management will help with the quantity issue. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So yeah, thank you, Catherine. That's a really, really good flag. If there are no other burning questions, I want to move on to our key asks, because there's another piece I want to make sure we get to before 5:30, which is these site-specific examples that we all can bring to the table, and then kind of our plan for coming to this meeting. So let's check this out. These are simple and probably missing some other things. Betsy brought up another ask that's not on here, so hoping to popcorn a little. But we're at this stage in our campaign, at least from the position of the Forest Waters Coalition, we're not ready yet to say this is the mechanism that you need to use to create the changes. We don't know yet what that mechanism is. But what we do know is that these agencies, it's their job to figure that out. And so right now, our kind of grassroots public facing ask is, we just need you to take action. We need to see concrete action. What that action is, the mechanisms that you use, well, that's, you know, up to you all and you all to discuss with, you know, your policy team and your technical staff. But right now, our communities are coming out and saying, we need you to take action on behalf of drinking water. The next two are more kind of specific asks, which are, we also need you to do a thorough science-based review of ODF's forest practice rules and the impacts of those on drinking water supplies. That has, as we saw, it was almost done in 2017, but it wasn't published. We need that to be published. And then the third one we have is that we need to make sure that Oregon's forestry rules are compliant with federal clean water standards and ensuring safe drinking water for our communities in perpetuity. And that could also say in the context of climate change, in perpetuity. So those are the three. Comments on those, questions on those, things to add. Maybe Betsy wants to restate her ask again too.
Okay, yeah, I was just saying, I think mine could be included as kind of a, you know, an example of these specific asks. You know, some specific things that I've encountered are that they're not monitoring, they're not publishing their raw water turbidity measurements. And that might sound like a bunch of gobbledygook, but that's how they need to measure it, and they do measure it, because if that water is too dirty, they can't let it come into the treatment plant or it'll ruin their equipment. So they're constantly monitoring that turbidity. But if the turbidity measurements are not made public, there's no way to show that that creek that's coming down from where the clear cuts originated is the cause of the turbidity. So they need to make that a requirement that they save those data, that raw water turbidity data. They need to save those and make those public, because we need to know what that is. So that's just one example. There's other reporting issues that are really terrible that we need to fix. I found out recently that they don't, it's, you know, their water utilities are required to report every month how much water they're using to the Department of Water Resources. They have to report for each water source that they have. But I found that they're not, sometimes they don't file these reports for years on end. And there's no excuse for that. The law says they should be doing it and there's a penalty, but yet it's not enforced. So that's another example of how they're just not collecting the information that we need to assess what is going on here. So that's something that I want to really stress. And then another example would be, you cannot really assess the impacts if you're not looking at, if you're not assessing at the watershed scale. A lot of these rules and regulations are based on ownership. It's just, you can't clear cut if it's more than a certain part of your ownership. That doesn't have any real relation to drinking water. You have to look at what's going on in the watershed, and you have to assess the cumulative impacts of what's going on in that watershed. So those three things, the reporting and the watershed information.
Thank you, Betsy.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I got a little carried away there.
No, don't apologize. You're wonderful. Thank you. And I just added some of the context of what you said into these asks. That's really good. I saw Catherine and Darlene, and then we'll move to some site-specific examples, tips and tricks, and strategy.
I was just going to raise the issue that some of you on the call already know, but others don't, that DEQ, along with ODF, with this new private forest accord, should have new power to go on site and do the monitoring instead of asking permission on private lands and being denied. And so, I think the EQC needs a little wake-up call to say, given your new power of monitoring on private lands, we expect, demand more action to enforce, to find the problems at their source and enforce the law. Or, find the problems at the source and call on better Forest Practices Act for drinking water. I guess that would be the better ask.
To give the agencies more power, essentially, of enforcement. And I know that one thing that actually was changed also with the private forest accord was that they did attempt to give the agencies more power, where they no longer have to ask permission to access private industrial lands to do that sort of testing. And I believe it's in the lead up to logging projects and also in the 3 years afterward. So that small piece of having to ask permission from logging companies to access their land is no longer the case. They can just go onto the land and do the necessary work that needs to be done. But I think the bigger picture of enforcement and lack of strength to enforce is huge.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if they all will know that at this point, because the HCP and the private forest accord doesn't necessarily rock their boat, but it gives them new power. So it's important for them to know.
Yeah, that's great. Darlene?
So I think this issue of every watershed for drinking water almost all of them cover many different ownerships. So there may be federal land, state forest, and private forest all in the one watershed. And I think that is a reason that we can stress in asking DEQ to step up. They have this arrangement with Department of Forestry, but Department of Forestry has a piece of a watershed, but it often does not have the whole thing. And so I think that's a strength to really point out of why Department of Environmental Quality really needs to do their job.
Thank you, Darlene. These are really, really good insights. I hope everyone's taking good notes. All right, well, with that, I want to pivot once more back to kind of the bigger picture of what we're bringing to the agencies on with our comments. And so in that messaging guide, which when I switch here, can you all see the messaging guide, or are you still seeing the keynote?
It hasn't changed.
It hasn't changed. You're seeing the keynote. Okay. Well, it's not important that you see the messaging guide because you have the link, but I do just want to really put in a plug for checking out all of the site-specific examples. So at the very end, after you get through all the science, also please check out the science. It's very helpful, but I would say that when it comes to sharing in public comment, especially when the oral comment, I think it's more powerful actually to speak from experience and also to speak about site-specific examples than to kind of reiterate the same science that everyone else could reiterate. It's nice to have that in your back pocket as a way to prove and get your back for your claims. But these are really, the site-specific examples are really the juice of why this is an issue. And so I wanted to share just a couple images just so you can kind of see some of the work that the Forest Waters Coalition is trying to do to tell the story. And so I mentioned Rockaway Beach as one place. On the right-hand side, you can see their drinking watershed. Peter and Betsy organized with North Coast Communities for watershed protection, which started in Rockaway and is a community that has, I think, been working the longest on getting protections for their drinking watershed than any community in Oregon. And this is one example that we often bring up because it's so storied. And what you're looking at here on the right-hand side is actually just, one way that we're trying to tell the story, where you can see the shape surrounded by blue of the drinking watershed. And inside of it, everything that's in red, so you can see this little key at the bottom here, has been clear cut in the last 20 years. Everything else in the light green line has not. And so these are just clear cuts. So you can see now, if you go to the top here, Rockaway Beach's watershed is one of 137 that have been hit aggressively hard. And the landowners responsible are Stimson and LNC TRS. So we're naming who is responsible as well. On the left, we have another example, because Rockaway Beach is sadly not the only example. Actually, the community of Wheeler had to invest in a new water system 16 years ago, and they ran a debt of over $1 million. And that was because of sedimentation. That was a result of rampant clear cutting in the watershed. And so they ended up just completely having to change their water system entirely. And you can see this image here, almost their entire watershed has been completely logged, and it's entirely owned almost by Stimson Lumber. So these are just kind of two images. We have actually a whole series of maps from the hardest hit drinking watersheds. Most of the ones that were named in that evidence document are some of the worst, hardest hit in the state, but there's a lot more examples. And so by way of kind of entering into the last piece of this discussion, which is just our strategy and what stories everyone has to tell and what you can bring, I want to just switch to the last slide here, which is tips and tricks for public comment. So the reason why I'm talking about these site-specific examples is because there's a real reason, there's a real value in having them. They're effective. They're a good tip. They're a good tip for actually making them listen to you. So in order to write a good public comment, you've got all these key messages, you've got so much science and site-specific examples. How do you actually make it hard-hitting? This is what we recommend. Be clear and direct. You can name the purpose of your comment at the very beginning. Make sure that you're very clear about what issue you're talking about. Don't bury the lead. Don't try and be super creative, but just say, hi, my name is this. This is where I'm hailing from, and I'm here to talk about this, about drinking water, and put your ask at the beginning. Lean on the evidence. That's why we give you all the science and also all these site-specific claims. It's really good to have that in your back pocket. Using the site-specific claims is very, very important. So we're recommending that everyone here find a way to tell this story in your own way. Why does it matter to you? Is it impacting your watershed? If not, one thing that I've been saying as someone from the Bull Run watershed right now is I'm thankful that my watershed is protected, but I work with a bunch of people whose watershed isn't. And so drinking water can't wait. And I kind of tell that story of the Bull Run watershed and how it got protected and how it's important to me that other communities receive the same protections. So that's bringing in your experience and site-specific examples. And then the last thing is offer a helpful alternative, which is the asks that we're giving. So I literally, when I write my comments, I just hit on each one of these things. I start with my clear ask and what I'm there for. I go into some evidence and some claims. Then I pivot to an example or two. I tie it to my own experience, and then I end with my demand, with my alternative, with what it is that I want. So with kind of this in mind, I did pull a couple examples of good comments from the last Board of Forestry meeting that we could listen to, or we could just kind of chat a little bit about what our strategy is going to be moving into this next meeting. So given that we have about 12 minutes, let's, I think, start with chatting about what our strategy is going to be. And maybe folks can share any site-specific examples that they have that they want to bring to the table. And if we have time, I can share that example at the end. So opening it up, thoughts, comments. Do people have any examples? I know that Peter and others can probably talk ad nauseum to examples of this issue being real, but anything that you'd want to highlight or share? Catherine, go for it.
Well, I think Salem, if anybody's in the Salem area, talking about the increase in clear cutting and the fertilizers used caused the algae bloom, and the costs were, I don't know, I can look it up actually, but you can look it up on, it's like in the $50 million range. I mean, people in the entire city had to drink bottled water. That's pretty expensive.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And in that particular case, I would look up that number and have that real number available to use that dollar number, because that's the kind of thing that, it's documented, it's big, and it has a lot of impact.
Yeah, and the Salem watershed is currently getting logged to pieces still. A lot of it has already, since the 2020 fires, but ODF is planning a lot of logging on state lands. Even the National Forest is logging in the Santiam watershed right now. So that is a really important site-specific example. Thank you, Catherine. Other site-specific examples or stories that are pertinent to bring in to this conversation, or just experiences. I think Peter had to drop off, which is a bummer because he's our Rockaway Beach person. Well, let me, since no one's kind of jumping up and down with examples, let me share the ones that I thought were really, really good. Last week, the Board of Forestry had a meeting, and we turned out a number of people to speak on behalf of drinking water. Now, this was the Board of Forestry, so they have different responsibilities than DEQ, but there were some really, really good comments that were given that had this format that I'm talking about with the messages, the science, and the site-specific examples. So I'm going to share just one. It's a 3-minute comment, and then we can just check in on it, and then we'll wrap up. Does that sound okay? Awesome. Okay, so let's see if I can do this. Here we go. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, here we go. Oh, it doesn't want me to share the audio. That's terrible. Maybe this won't work then. Let's try. Could you hear that? No? Okay, I'm gonna try one more thing then without sharing it, because this is good. Can you hear that now? Yeah, okay. So that was the end of the last comment. I'm going to show you this one. This is by Lisa Arkin from Beyond Toxics. And I think she just did a really beautiful job of pointing to a site-specific example that was just incredibly hard-hitting. So here we go. She's getting there.
Are we supposed to be able to hear this now?
Yeah, we
We-
can't hear anything.
Oh, I was thinking that you were hearing it the whole time.
No, we haven't.
I'm sitting here listening to it. That's funny. Well, that's a bummer. I guess the technology isn't going to work for us. What I can do is I'll just share the link. It's online. The Board of Forestry keeps all their meeting minutes. And actually there were 7 comments that were all really good. Sorry that technology didn't work. I've been struggling with technology all day. But I think the main point is they did a study of the Nehalem watershed specifically and had a lot of unique information to bring to the table about just the amount of aerial sprays that were done in that drinking watershed in a very short amount of time. And also brought a lot of information to bear about who relies on that drinking watershed and also what kinds of fish species are using that drinking watershed for habitat. And it was just one deep dive into a very deep site-specific example, but it was very powerful. And so I guess the last piece I want to talk about with y'all is just what we're really hoping to do is orchestrate a mass turnout to this next meeting. And what we would really love, we don't want everyone to sound exactly the same, but we do want to be reiterating these messaging points, but with our own examples and our own experience to bear. So if folks, have thoughts about what they would like to talk about, if anyone is like, I have this idea, but I'm not quite sure if it's a good one, in the last 5 minutes, I'd just love to open up space for any kind of lingering thoughts about what might be a good thing to bring with that strategy, questions that you have, ideas you want to share, any last words sort of thing. Our most loquacious people jumped off the call.
Well, barring that, do you know when written testimony must be submitted to have it ahead of the 17th meeting?
To have it ahead of the meeting, I think you just need to submit it ahead of the meeting. But they have the window open for submitting written testimony after the meeting. So even if you can't submit it before, you can still submit it after.
Is there a time limit for the public comment? I mean, usually they say 3 minutes and then you carefully prepare 3 minutes and then at the last minute they cut it down to 2. And that's really bad. So I don't know. I think I would try to get my oral comments down to 2 minutes just in case they do that. And and then you can submit a longer version of it in writing.
That's usually what I do too. I think 2 is safe. They do say 3, but they often cut it down to 2. And if there are a lot of us, which hopefully there will be, they will cut it down to 2. So be prepared for 2 minutes. And since it doesn't seem like there's a bunch of questions, I know that I just kind of dropped this on you. Do you have any questions or thoughts? But I'm here to bounce those questions back and forth. I'll follow up with everyone who registered for this with just a reminder with the link to this document and a link to the Board of Forestry recording so you can hear those good comments as examples. But I'm happy to answer questions and look over drafts of comments or just tell you that you're awesome in the lead up to your comment. Or, to dig into some of these site specific examples more. Because as we know, this is not just an issue that's affecting a few of us. This is an issue for all of us. And so the more folks we can bring out, the better we are. So with that, I will let all of you get back to your evenings, but I really appreciate you for taking the time and bringing your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Have a good night, everyone.
You too.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sam.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.